Jesus knew his Father's heart, and the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, didn't. That's why Jesus knew how to apply the law. And sometimes even he would do things that from the Pharisees' point of view seemed to be breaking the law, because Jesus knew the heart of why it was given. We need to really consider what we are reading. And we considered the what last time. So the what of the Bible passage we've just read. And we considered several questions that will help us to understand that passage of Scripture, what we're actually reading. When we ask these questions, we're trying to look at the Scripture in its proper context. And we're trying to find the answer to the question, what did that Scripture actually mean to its original readers? So before we can work out what that means for us, we need to try and understand what it meant in its original time to its original receivers. Scripture can't suddenly mean something different to what it originally meant. So once we've discovered that, we can then move on to the next group of questions. And the big overarching question is, so what? This is the group of questions that we often fail to ask or give little service to. But it's so important to our understanding of that Scripture. So the first question, why is the Scripture there? There are so many things that have gone on throughout history. God has been involved in the lives of humans since he created Adam and Eve. There's so much that he could have included in this book, the Bible, to help us to know who he is, who we are, his will and mission for our lives. A question, therefore, that's worth it to ask is, why was this event, this conversation, this thought, etc., chosen to be included in Scripture? What was it placed there to achieve? This question can be asked of whole books as well as individual passages. Some books help us to answer this question. So the Gospel of John, for example, he actually tells us why he's writing the Gospel. So he identifies that he saw a lot of the events that took place, and not even an entire library could include everything that he has seen and heard. In John 21, verse 24, it says this: "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. The chapter before this then gives John's reasoning as to how and why he has specifically chosen to include certain events and to exclude other events. So in John 20, verse 30, he says this: "Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name." So John has specifically chosen to include the events, the conversations, and the miracles to help us to know who Jesus is and the effect that that will have on our lives. And that means for each miracle we read of, the miracle itself and the way he has recorded it, it should help us to understand more about the identity of Jesus and help us to live life to the full. Knowing that changes the way we read the story. It affects the way John writes it. In telling the story of Jesus walking on the water, for instance, he omits the part where Peter also tries to walk on water. Why is that? Well, I believe it's because John wants us to focus on what Jesus is doing, what it reveals about him, and what that means for us. The purpose of other scriptures might not be as immediately obvious or made as clear as the Gospel of John. But it's worth asking, why is this included? So for Paul's letters, for example, which make up a large portion of the New Testament, were written to address specific situations in the local church or the local group of churches. And if we don't take time to discover what those situations are, then we can easily misread what he is saying. What was the original point? So the questions that we asked last week help us with the answer to this question. We often read Paul's letters or the parables of Jesus as if they were written directly to us in the 21st century. They weren't. They were written or spoken to specific people in specific situations. And we need to try and understand the situations that the Bible speaks into in order to find out what was the point that was being made. So a lot of the parables, for example, that were told by Jesus were in order that people could understand his first coming. And we often read them as if they were a direct explanation of his second coming. So they can apply to that, but actually we need to understand what was the original context. Another question to ask is this: what other scriptures speak about the same thing? When we're trying to understand what God thinks about a subject or a situation, it's wise to look at what other scriptures can say to help to give us that bigger picture. It's even more useful to look at scriptures where the instruction at first seems to contradict the one we've just read. This helps us to understand what is the principle behind the instruction. So a great example of this is the Sabbath. God gives instructions for people to keep the Sabbath. The Jews were told to rest on the Sabbath, that's the Saturday, and not to do any work. If you read the Old Testament instructions on the subject, it seems that God cares dearly about this particular day. However, when we read what Jesus does on the Sabbath and how he uses King David as an example of when King David broke some of the Sabbath laws, we discover something else. God cares about us trusting him, and he cares about us not mistreating each other. In fact, that's why the Sabbath laws were given. And God enforced the Sabbath in order to make sure that people, and especially the poor, wouldn't be forced to work, because the poor were often forced into slavery and they were forced to work every day. And the Sabbath laws protected them. And it's only when we read all the scriptures that concern the Sabbath that we start to discover this very point. What are the similarities or differences between our situation and their situation? So we could start, for instance, with what is the covenant that this scripture was written into, and what's the covenant that we now live in? What are the similarities and differences between those two things? Because a lot of things build on one another. So a lot of the Old Testament practices were a foreshadow of what is to come. So they were an example of an ultimate fulfillment that was to come later on. So for instance, to give you an example, the Exodus and a lot of things that happened around the Exodus were an example of the ultimate freedom that Christ would bring. So what we do now is important because it is a foreshadow of what's to come as well. It's a foreshadow of what's to come when God recreates the heavens and the earth. Even if a scripture is written in the same covenant as us, we still need to understand the similarities or differences between our situation and the situation of the person that it's being written to. And this mainly concerns the letters, for example. There are instructions that are given, to give you an example, in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10 concerning food that's sacrificed to idols. Now, that might not be a situation that we find in our town today. It might be, but it might not be as well. But it doesn't mean that those instructions are irrelevant. If we can establish why they were given and why they were given into that particular situation, we can take the principles out of that and apply them to some of the situations that we find today. So when we look at the similarities between our situation and theirs, we start to see how that logic can, and that those principles can be applied. What are the timeless truths? This is what we're really trying to get to. What are the principles? We can think Scripture means one thing, and it's good to consider all the possible meanings of Scripture. We need to look, though, is this an absolute instruction that fits all circumstances? Is this something that's spoken to a specific situation? The answer to these questions help us to find the timeless truths, the principles that we can take and apply to our situation today. We're trying to discover how God thinks. We're trying to find out what is important to God. There's a scripture about David and his heart beating after God's. We're trying to read the Bible in such a way that what's important to God is important to us. That way, our hearts will start to beat after God's. So it's by asking these sort of questions that we're able to sift out what was culturally specific and discover the Bible principles, the timeless Bible principles that we can apply to our lives today. If we don't do this, then we end up either ignoring Scripture because it no longer seems relevant, or we try to shoehorn practices that were meant for another situation into our situation. To give you one final illustration to help us to understand this. A few years ago, many years ago now, I took up guitar lessons. And I took it up because I wanted to be able to play worship songs. I wanted to be able to worship God on my guitar. I took lessons with a gentleman called Barney. Now, Barney wasn't a Christian, and he didn't know many contemporary worship songs. And so a lot of the songs I practiced with him were from bands such as U2 and Green Day. I couldn't take these songs and just play them in church. But the thing is, Barney wasn't teaching me to play a particular song. Instead, he was teaching me to play the guitar. That's why everything he taught me was useful. So even if I couldn't just take it from the music room and play it directly in church, I was learning the principles of how to play the guitar. And this is what we're trying to learn here. We're not just trying to take a chapter from Deuteronomy and try to play it in our situation. That would be like trying to play a song from AC/DC as a worship music. It probably wouldn't work. Some people would like it, but it probably wouldn't work. We take the principles that we've learned by learning that song from AC/DC, and we apply those principles to playing the worship music that we're going to play in church. And so we look at the chapter or the passage that we're reading. We look at it in order to find out how God thinks in different situations, how God gives instructions in different situations, what makes God's heart beat. and we take those same principles and we apply it to our situation today.